Tweed Roosevelt, university professor and chairman of the Roosevelt School of Public Policy and International Affairs at Long Island University, is the great-grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, a member of one of the most respected families in the United States. He led the effort to award President Theodore Roosevelt the Congressional Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military honor. He has held many leadership roles at the Theodore Roosevelt Association, and he has retraced many of Theodore Roosevelt's expeditions. Tweed has taught at Harvard University and Columbia University's School of Business. He holds a BA from Harvard College, an MBA from Columbia University, and a doctorate of humane letters. It is my great privilege to introduce Tweed Roosevelt.
Well, thank you, Ellen. And let's see if my picture comes up. I don't know. Does it look all fine? I'm not going to share screen just yet. Does it look okay, everybody? Ellen?
Good. Looks good to me.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure. And when I get ready to share the screen, you'll let me know if I actually succeeded in doing it. Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's great to see you all. I can't say that I've ever been to Brentwood, but I must go the next time I come down to Long Island University, which will be shortly. We're busily starting this new School of Public Policy and International Affairs. It's really a big deal. I started an institute there, and now it's grown into a major school within the university. So that's a lot of fun. The other thing I'm working on that might interest you before I get into this talk is something called the Society for Presidential Descendants. And there was no organization for presidential descendants, so I created one. And we're going to have our first, Long Island University is our administrative home, and we're going to have our first big event next June out there. We expect maybe 150 to 200 presidential descendants to come, and a good portion of that will be open to the public, so some of you may want to be involved in it. We also will be doing a book prize for the best book on presidential leadership. And our first sort of award of that will be this October in New York City at the University Club. Any interest in all that, go and Google or whatever, roosevelt.liu.edu. So anyway, having gotten through the advertisement, let me start in. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about TR, a conservationist, which is really one of my very favorite subjects. And what I'm going to talk about is what he was how he prepared himself to be our environmentalist president, and then what he achieved. And I think you'll find it sort of interesting. Now, it's interesting to note, today, pretty much everybody agrees that TR's greatest achievement was his conservation effort, but he didn't. He's recorded it saying this. What he thought his most important achievements were the building up of the Navy and the Panama Canal, both of which he did, but history disagrees with him. So now I'm going to divide my remarks this afternoon into two parts. First, we'll explore how he became the environmentalist that he was eventually, and then we'll look into his achievements, starting with his founding of something called the Boone and Crockett Club. So I thought I'd begin this with his beginning of the journey, and I'm going to try to show you. I'm going to have a lot of slides, so you don't have to look at me. Let me bring up nope, that's not the way to do it. I gotta share the screen first, I think. There we go. And now I'm going to make this huge. And that should do it. Did that work?
It worked.
It worked. Now, if you look at your little thumbnail sketch of Ellen on the top right, or maybe it's me on the top right, if you hover over that with your cursor, you'll see a little bar at the top.
To an extent, banishing his daughter, there's a balance there, but every action taken.
Somebody's talking. If you put your cursor over that little bar and click it, that will more or less make that thumbnail disappear, and you can then see the whole screen. So let's start with TR as a, I never can make this work. There we go. TR as a very young boy, before he could read, just after he could stand, would go into his father's library and pull down books. And one of his favorites was this one, Livingstone's Missionary Travels in South Africa. He couldn't read yet, but what he could do is look at the pictures, and there were all kinds of exciting pictures of animals and doing things. And he'd cart this book around and get people to show it to him. And as he got older and started reading, his father discovered his interest in natural history and very early started buying him books on natural history, first for the little kids and then on. And I'll really start this story with an actual event that happened to him in New York City. Nearby his house, there was a fish market, and the fishmonger somehow acquired a carcass of a harbor seal, which he had placed in front of his store to kind of attract people to come in. And it certainly attracted TR. I love seals. To me, they are dogs. And there's a scene, I think they look just like dogs. But in any case, TR saw the seal, and he was fascinated by it. And he came back day after day and he measured it this way and that way and how much around and how long and whatever, and started keeping notes. And this is something he'd do for the rest of his life, note keeping. And after several days, the seal became, well, shall we say, a little ripe. And the owner of the store was ready to get rid of him. And TR begged that he chop the head off and TR take the head home, which he did, into his kitchen. He lived on East 20th Street, where he wanted to boil a skull with a head down so he could save the skull and create something he called the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History, which was a cabinet in his outside of his bedroom. The cook and maids, of course, were horrified, but that started it. Well, he was quite eclectic in his interest to begin with as a little boy, but it quickly settled on birds. And there you see his brother. I couldn't find a picture of TR with a bird. So here's his older brother, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., his oldest son with a bird. And so TR loved birds. And when he was little, very little, he started going out into the countryside, Oyster Bay, New Jersey, up the Hudson Valley, all the way to the Adirondacks, mostly looking at birds, but collecting all kinds of other things. Now, TR didn't realize it, but he was very nearsighted. And so he focused first, he really could hardly see the birds for the most part, but he focused on listening to their sounds, the bird sounds, the chirps and so on. And that's how he sort of first experienced birds. Later, when he discovered he was nearsighted and they got him glasses, he could then see everything. But this sort of focused his view, focused on how he looked at the natural world. Normally, people would start looking and seeing the animals. He started with the sounds. So it's a little like if you took a deaf person to go to an opera, let's say, and the person couldn't hear the singing, so the person would focus on the costumes and the scenery and all sorts of other things. And later, when they got a hearing aid and could hear, they would hear the music, but they will always have a different kind of attitude about the surrounding environment of the opera, and in TR's case, of the landscape. And this played a huge role in his being an environmentalist, because it was much broader than just looking at the animals. Well, he started going to the Adirondacks, and this thing won't work like it's supposed to. There are the Adirondacks up there. And there was a place called Paul Smith's Lodge, which was kind of a watering hole for New Yorkers. And he would go up there often alone when he was 8, 9, 10 years old, and often with his family, and examine the whole area. And he would be looking at birds, and he would be collecting animals. He was slowly building up his collection. Now, his father supported this. And so when TR got to be sort of 8 or 9 or 10, his father found a taxidermist named Bell in New York, who was willing to train TR how to be a taxidermist. And Bell, who was a very famous man in his own right, he accompanied James Audubon on one of his trips. He taught TR how the skills of taxidermy, and TR became quite good at it and did much of this. Now, as his world broadened, he started, his family would take him and his brothers and sisters on long trips through Europe. These would last several months. Europe, Egypt, and the Near East, sort of the thing, the grand tours that people did. And TR started very young, keeping a journal. This is a published version of it. And they were careful journals. He made notes. He pretty much entered every day, at least during the summers and during his trips, even if the entry only said, we did today pretty much what we did yesterday. But in this, he kept careful records of what he saw, what he collected, and where he collected, and all kinds of sort of biological details. He was also a fairly good artist. This is, as I think of maybe a 10 or 11-year-old, this is some kind of a sparrow in Europe. There's the photograph, and there's his drawings. He didn't do a bad job, I think. Well, one of these trips included a lengthy trip on the Nile, and what his father did is rent a boat like this, and they would sail up the Nile. This was a very popular thing amongst upper class New Yorkers, Americans, and Brits and Europeans. So there were lots of people doing this, and TR would see other famous people along the way. Every day, the little boat would pull over to the side, and while everybody else was looking at Egyptian things, TR was out collecting birds for the most part. His father had given him a little gun, and so he would shoot them and he'd bring them back to his cabin where he'd prepare them for taxidermy. And this was a stinky process with dangerous drugs like arsenic. He wasn't the most popular with everybody. After they finished that, they then went to Petra, the rose-colored city, half as old as time, a gorgeous place, and collected various things around the Middle East. So he was really very much focused and primarily on birds. After that trip they had done, after sort of the grand tour, his father placed the 4 kids with the Minkwintzes in Austria. This is a picture of the Mr. Minkwitz and his wife. I'm very proud of this picture. I found it not long ago. First time anybody's found a picture of this guy. Actually, he's mentioned in all the biographies, but just by name, not what he was. He was actually a state, or equivalent to a U.S. representative, quite a prominent guy. Anyway, they spent, I don't know, 3 or 4 months there learning about history, learning to speak German and French, and many other things. So by the time he got to Harvard, he was a pretty he had a pretty broad knowledge about ornithology and the natural world. And he wanted to continue his work in collecting there. One of the first people he met was this fellow, Henry Minot, also a Harvard freshman, and if anything, more knowledgeable than TR was about birds. And they became fast friends. And that first summer, between freshman and sophomore year, they went to the Adirondacks, where they went bird watching. And TR and he wrote, it's TR's first publication, which is the short bird list of birds seen in that county in the Adirondacks. It was it's rather sparse, but actually quite complete, and recognized at the time as an important contribution. In fact, Seahart Merriman, who was the leading naturalist in the United States at the time, I'll have some more to say about him later, he wrote a review of this in the only ornithological journal of the time, praising it. So TR had gotten off to a pretty good start. During his college years, he started going to Maine. Now, I haven't mentioned, I suppose most of you know, that TR was a sickly kid, seriously disabled with asthma, which was a very, very dangerous and difficult disease at the time, and terrifying to the sufferer, to the sufferer's parents, and even to the sufferer's doctors. And they knew little what to do about it. So the kind of things they would prescribe is this little, when he was younger, like 5 and 6 years old, they'd have him smoking huge cigars and drinking quantities of coffee, which was thought to be good for helping to at least ameliorate the effects of asthma. They probably did something, but anyway, he was struggling. Well, he decided, or it was decided to send him to Maine. They went to way northern Maine. That's him on the right. And there were 2 guides who he spent time with on several trips. They were only slightly older than him, probably in their early 20s at the time. And they were lumbermen, very experienced, and also did some guiding, and they were hunters. And they became tremendous role models to TR about teaching him about how the outdoor world, in a wholly different kind of, and much more, if you will, primitive or natural state as northern Maine was at the time. And he learned a great deal from them, and they established a lifelong relationship. In fact, these 2 guides came out when TR went to the West and became his ranch hands. So that was much of what he learned. Now, there was something called, let me get this straight. There was something called the Nuttall Ornithological Club. Nuttall was a guy, here he is, and this was kind of and pretty much the only ornithological operation at the time. And TR had joined it and gotten involved in some of the major events of the time. One of them was something known as the Sparrow Wars. Here, these are English sparrows. They were brought over to the United States because it was thought they could eat various pests of our trees and farms, but they went completely out of control. And the English sparrows, as we call it today, really took over, and it supplanted many native species. And at TR's time, at this time, shortly after around his college years, there were 2 groups of people, some who thought what we should do is exterminate them, and others that thought what we should do is just let them go, that they were fine and they were good birds. And TR plunged himself into this. He was on the destroy them side. Well, as that turned out, it was hopeless. And as usual, both sides are more or less correct. But you can certainly see that no success was done in exterminating them. And they're all still with us. Another controversy he got involved with was something called the Nature Fakers. Now, this was later, but I'll tell you some of his controversies. The Nature Fakers controversy. When TR was president, there were people publishing books at the time. It was very popular for people to anthropomorphize animals, that is, to make them seem human. And they went to great lengths, some of these people, and they'd write stories about how they had seen birds like this snipe on the top right here, who put a cast on a broken leg, or other birds. I think these are probably Baltimore Orioles, who were learning how to use needles, making thorns to make them into needles and sewing things, and schools, running schools for their children and the like. And TR objected to this, not that he objected to it as a story. He thought if these were stories like Mowgli, that was fine. But as real natural history, he thought it was totally inappropriate. And so he joined battle, but he couldn't take him on directly because in those days it was felt that a president could not and should not take on a private citizen. So he got other peoples to fight the battle with him. And eventually he couldn't completely control himself. So he wrote a couple of articles for things like Scribner's magazine, taking these people to task. Another big controversy of the time was what was called the lumpers and the splitters. And there's TR with Merriman. You remember I mentioned him earlier, the leading American naturalist. TR at this point was a young man when he got into the lumpers and splitter issues. What it was that there were 2 schools of thought about defining a species. And some defined them very narrowly. And as a result, there were lots of species that were almost all alike. And others, the lumpers, those were the lumpers. The no, sorry, get it right. Those were the splitters. The lumpers wanted to have much more broad definitions of what species are. So include all kinds of different things. And Trump and TR sort of focused or decided or supported the lumpers. He said it was horrifying when suddenly he discovered that a good friend of his, a particular bird, had been divided up into a dozen new acquaintances, and he didn't like that. So he fought the good fight on the lumpers side, and Merriman was on the splitters side. And TR, an audacious young man, decided to challenge Merriman to a debate at the Cosmos Clubs in Washington on this subject as part of whatever the organization was involved with it then. And so the day came and TR showed up, and Merriman and he debated. The audience was entirely professional biologists, and it was generally decided that Merriman had won, and TR sort of accepted his victory. Merriman, who really admired TR, decided to hold up to sort of a condolence thing to TR. So what Merriman did, which I thought was quite clever of him, he found certain species of elk. He knew TR loved elk. And so being a splitter, he created a new species of an elk, which was found in the West somewhere, out in the far West in the Pacific Northwest, and called it Curvus roosevelti after TR. So of course TR was tickled pink and loved the idea. And so the whole thing was more or less buried at that stage. So now let's look at TR's next major step as his education as a conservationist. And that occurred when he went out west on his ranch. He was a rancher for a number of years. There's a whole nother story of that. By the way, I've given a series of talks called Tales of TR, one of them about TR's adventures in the West and many other subjects. They were recorded and available online. So if you go to roosevelt.liu.edu, you could watch them. Any case, this was a period that significantly furthered his education as a conservationist. And he continued his habit of very careful observation, first of all, of the wild animals in the wild, and then carefully dealing with the carcasses, measuring them, recording very carefully what was in the stomach, all kinds of sort of biological important issues that were not known at the time. And then he wrote a series of 4 books on the subject. And they were hunting books, but not the sort of typical bullets and blood kind of books, but extensive descriptions of the animals that he had come across there. And these books were of considerable interest to naturalists because little was known about these, especially the larger animals. And TR, by the time he was president, was considered the leading wildlife, large game naturalist in the country, that he knew more than anyone else. So this was a very critical period in his development. First of all, his political development, it established him as an American, more than just an East Coast, but an American with a base in the West, which was very important to him politically. And from an environmental point of view, he saw firsthand the crisis that was happening in the United States. At the time, nobody really, or most nobody, believed that we had anything but just unlimited resources, natural resources, whether it be the animals or whether it be the forests, all kinds of things. And TR saw, starting with the buffalo, that this just wasn't true, that the buffalo was almost exterminated, the elk was close to it, many other animals were the same. And so this began his thinking that something had to be done to save our environment, and particularly our species. And he also saw sort of natural resources, the erosion of land that came from the clear cutting of trees, the arid land that where water no longer went, the sort of very wasteful way of mining and the like. So by the time he left the West, he was now very well prepared for the role he would play, uh, certainly better prepared than pretty much every American, and certainly of any president that he would play as he went further in his career. So the next step was to create the Boone and Crockett Club. And that's a symbol of the medal, the Boone and Crockett. This was a group of sportsmen and scientists he formed in his living room in New York to address the issues of conservation in the country of the type I've just mentioned to you. And this was really the first powerful organization. It was really a political lobbying organization. He created it in 1888, and it's important to note that a large portion of the members of this were hunters. Hunters played an extremely important role in the initial conservation efforts, and in fact, even to this day, play a very large role in conservation. They, of course, are interested in conserving the species that they hunt, but basically it turns into huge efforts to put aside large reserves of land for these animals to breed in, and also to create sensible and humane and appropriate, or whatever you want to say, game laws. So this organization, the Boone and Crockett Club, had a number of achievements fairly early on. To start with, they felt that if Americans didn't understand what wildlife was out there, it was much harder to get them to be interested in doing anything to try to save them. So the first step they took was creating zoos. Believe it or not, there weren't any zoos. And so they backed the creation of the National Zoo in Washington, which is there today. And there you see a bunch of school kids with a school marm, I guess, there, and the buffalo. The buffalo are almost gone then. So the idea was, if you can get the kids to appreciate the animal life, you can then get them to appreciate the need for conservation. He also did the same in creating the Bronx Zoo. Here's an early picture of it. Another thing they focused on was Yellowstone. Yellowstone was the first national park. TR didn't create it. It was created before the 1880s. So the land was saved, but there was no sort of enforcement there. And this resulted in considerable abuse of this very large and beautiful place. First of all, people started arriving. And here's a sort of a period picture of the time. This was relatively harmless, but the next thing that happened is trains came in. And this brought all kinds of large numbers of people and all kinds of activities that were not appropriate to a national park, at least would be seen today. And the result is market hunters, for example. A market hunter was somebody who went out, did not play by any of sort of the ordinary fair chase rules, just slaughtered animals to be shipped back east and served in restaurants. TR and the Boone and Crockett Club would later make it illegal nationally for restaurants to serve wild game. And they still don't today. When you see elk or whatever you see in a restaurant, it's all farm raised. So these game hunters were devastating the wildlife. The Boone and Crockett Club began to support creating this, and I'll go into some length a little later on about this. And the other thing they basically focused on was big game. Here are examples. These are bronzes of 4 big game animals. So that one of their members' comment was that beetles will remain unchanged for the ages, but big game will vanish. And so they focused their efforts on this. I love these bronzes. And if any of you are feeling particularly generous, you could probably find these somewhere online, buy them and send them to me. Now hunters, oh yeah, let me get, they're hunters after all. And so they didn't spend all their time talking about serious issues. They sometimes imbibed of something, and they created their own brand of whiskey here, which I think only they use. I don't know if you can buy this. TR wasn't a particular drinker, but anyway. So now I want to go to what he achieved as president. I rather like this. I guess it's a pin, and has some aspects of the 1900 run for president here, Vice President McKinley as president. Well, TR was shortly elevated to the presidency with the assassination of McKinley after only, I think, something like 4 months of his time. And one of the way the TR approached the presidency was he looked upon it as an opportunity to achieve a certain number of things. And he knew he had only so much political capital. And so he wanted to focus on things he could achieve. So TR was not interested in fighting Pyrrhic battles where he knew he couldn't win. He picked 5, 6, maybe 7 areas that he wanted to focus in as president. He called it practical politician, where he thought he had a good chance of making it happen. They might be stretch targets, but he thought it might be, he had a good chance of making them come into reality. And that's the way he would approach it. And he would do everything he could to make these things happen. And one, of course, was conservation. One of his major ones was conservation. And he faced tremendous resistance. First of all, Americans, as I said earlier, didn't believe that conservation was a problem. The environmental out there was endless. Second, congressmen, and I use this as sort of an example of a senator, congressmen were controlled then, as they are today, much by the special interests in those days, especially railroads, miners, foresters, and the like. And they would keep passing legislation that supported them and paid no attention to the environmental issues or impacts. So TR would lecture them, but he was getting pretty much nowhere. There was one famous congressman who said, when TR had been lecturing this, is, "What has posterity ever done for me? Mr. President, you keep talking about posterity. I don't see posterity as any useful thing." TR realized that the only way to get Congress to focus on environmental issues and override the pressure of the business people was to get the people behind him. And so he used what he called the bully pulpit to convince the American people that they needed to do this. And it was a long campaign. He spent most of his presidency doing it, and as you will see, largely successful. One of the first things he faced was what's known as the Feather Wars. Now, in those days, women loved to have their hats, and they wore hats all the time in those days, much more popular than now, bird feathers, and in some case, even whole birds, as you can see here. And that was the rage at the time. I don't know if these women thought they invented this, but they certainly didn't. This was a tradition that went back. Here are some period pieces. It went back generations of people, women and men, wearing feathered headdresses. I particularly like the guy on the right, who is a New Guinea, and I think he wins the prize. But in any case, this feather mania went to extremes. Here you have whole birds on top of people's heads. These are real photographs of pictures. And the most ridiculous, I think, one of all is this one. God knows who she was. Now, the problem with this was, in order to get the feathers for the hats, the market hunters would go to bird rookeries, and during the breeding season, when the birds were in their most spectacular feathered state, shoot the ball and then use the carcasses and feathers for these hats. And birds were being destroyed, even being brought close to extinction. And there was a movement afoot to do something about this. And a group of people came to the White House to try to lobby TR into doing something about it. And they used as their example a little place called Pelican Island, which was about 3 acres and had about 30 species of birds breeding there. Examples like this and this. And the market hunters were going down and killing them all. And so this group in the White House said, well, Mr. President, you got to do something about it. It turned out that Pelican Island, which is in the Indian River in Florida, was on federal land. So TR turned to an aide, military aide he had there, and said, is there any law that prevents me from making a bird reserve? And the aide didn't know quite what to say that. Nobody had ever heard of a preserve. He said, TR wanted to make a federal bird preserve. Nobody had ever heard of a bird reserve. So the aide said, well, no, I guess, Mr. President, there isn't. And so TR then said, I so declare. And he made this the first bird preserve and also U.S. game preserve in the country, which started the whole sort of effort for federal game and bird preserves. There's now, I think, 51 of them across the country. And the largest, which seems to me amazing, the largest is 2,500. It's a good start. 2,500, not acres, 2,500 square miles. It's bigger than Connecticut. It's in Alaska, of course, where else? And that's the biggest bird preserve of the 51 we have now. In other areas that TR focused on in conservation were land reclamation kinds of things, all kinds of hunting regulations, all kinds of other sort of protections for the lands. And I want to focus now on 2 of them, the parks, national parks and national forests. Now, TR's work as a environmentalist has spawned by Douglas Brinkley this 900-page book on the subject. So you see, we could go on a long time, but don't have time for all that. This is the longest single book to date written on TR. As I say, it's over 900 pages. Well, anyway, we're going to focus on parks and forests. And this is a story, among other things, of 2 men. The guy on the left is a guy named John Muir, and a guy on the right is named Gifford Pinchot. And they represented radically different approaches to how do you preserve and conserve our natural forests. Muir on the left was a preservationist. He wanted the forests kept exactly as they are now. Meaning at that time, exactly as they are. Don't change them, don't do anything, just basically wall them off. And Pinchot, who was the first American forester, had to go to Europe for his training, and he and his family established the Yale Forestry School and sort of be the father of forestry in the US. His view was what at the time was called wise use, sustainable use, we'd call it now. He said that the forests are there, they're very useful to us, but we should use them in a way that are sustainable and not destructive. And these 2 were at each other's throat. TR knew them both well. And for each of those, it was my way or the highway, but TR saw that they were both right. And so he thought that what you needed to do was support both approaches. And so you have, and many people are confused between a national park and a national forest. You have a national park, Muir's preservationist approach, and then you have national forests, which was Pinchot's sustainable development. So let's talk a little about some of them. We'll start with national parks. Now, Yellowstone was already a national park. TR couldn't make national parks himself. He had to get Congress to do it. And in order to do that, he get the people to do it. So the major one unsaved at the time of TR was the Grand Canyon. And here you see one of the very first, this is the first car that ever made it to the Grand Canyon, and that absolute maniac sitting there on the edge. But of course, where one car came, more came. And nobody was, there was no real, Congress didn't want to turn it into a national park. They wanted to let business interests mine it, put hotels all over it and all kinds of other things. And so TR felt he had to do something to save it. Well, he couldn't force Congress. Believe it or not, Congress refused to make a national park out of the Grand Canyon. So what TR did is, by executive power, he could make something called a national monument and something called a game preserve, as already taught. And he made the bottom a game preserve and the side a national monument. He said Congress will come to its senses, and eventually they did. So now let's look at the national forest system. There are the national forests of today. Those green is the national forest. You can see many of them are in the West, but there's quite a bit of them. And you'll notice on the top left in the 3 Northwest states, there's a significant amount of national forests there. So here's the story. TR could make a national forest by writing an executive order, and he did that throughout his presidency. But when he got close to the end of his presidency, he was beginning to lose. Congress was beginning to figure out how to stop him. And what they did, actually, is on a bill that he absolutely had to sign, an agricultural bill, which was equivalent to a money bill today. TR knew he had to sign it, but Congress attached a rider to it that made it illegal for the president, naming this president, TR, to make any more national forests in the top in the 3 Northwest states. So that went to the White House for his signature. He knew he had to sign it, but he knew he also had something like, I forget what it is, 12 days to sign it. So he called in Pinchot and spread maps on the executive office floor, and they began drawing circles around or delineating borders of national forests. And then he wrote up the paperwork to make 51 new national forests in those states. Now, the smallest national forest in the country is 1 million acres, so this is a lot of land. 51 new national forests. He signed them, and then he signed the bill. And he said, I know Congress is going to do handstands about this, but there's nothing they could do about it. And there was nothing they could do about it. So till today, this is the highest amount of national forest percentage lands in any states in the country. So his list of achievements was extraordinary. Today, there are about 400 million acres of federal land. The land in red there is in the federal land in the lower 48 states, ignoring Alaska there. That's 400 million. More than half of those were reserved by one man, TR. He preserved some 230 million acres. So his achievements as president, let's see. Let's talk a little about those. In summary, he created 21 reclamation projects. Those are basically dams, 150 national forests, 51 bird preserves, 4 game reserves, 18 national monuments, and 5 national parks, including Crater Lake and Wind Canyon, Mesa Verde, and of course, eventually the Grand Canyon. That's 230 million acres. I'll give you an idea of what 230 million acres is. It's about the area, it's equal to the the size of 15 states, or about the area of all the states that touch the Atlantic. And basically 1 out of every 7 acres in the lower 48 United States. So in conclusion, I'll note that TR, during his presidency, lamented the fact there was no great war. He didn't want a war for war's sake, but what he was saying was that there's no president can be great unless he's president during a war. And so, sort of the greats like Washington, Lincoln, FDR, TR felt he could never be in their rank. Well, first of all, I think we as a people are extremely lucky that he spent his time doing what he did, and it's a lot more than I've had time to tell you about today. This is just one area of his achievements. We're lucky he didn't have a war. And in spite of what people think about TR as being bellicose, it's good to remember that his was the only presidency in the 20th century during whose tenure not a single soldier of US soldier fired a shot in anger at any other foreign soldier in a in a crisis of his own making. In other words, after the Philippines War was settled, we didn't, and there were many, many opportunities, and it was a very dangerous period. If you want to learn more about it, go to my talk on TR Master Diplomat or some others. So it's really kind of astonishing that the man who most people would say was the most likely to get us into war was the only one in the 20th century that didn't get us into war. And so I think we can be thankful for what he was able to do for us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over. I can figure out how to get out of here. Turn it over for the Q&A. There we go. And I am at your service. And Ellen, I'm going to get you out of here at 5 o'clock.
You're doing fine, Tweed. This is fascinating. You know, one of the things that I noticed on the map that you had of the national parks and such was that New York State has very, very little. There was only one tiny little speck in upstate New York that was federal preserved.
And the reason for that, of course, I didn't show the state reserves. The Adirondacks is huge.
Yeah.
But the reason for that was that he could only work on federal land, and most of the land on the East Coast, on the east of the Mississippi, was no longer federal land. It had been homesteaded or before homesteading or whatever. So he could only work there, and that's why most of his efforts were in the far west.
Okay, that clarifies. I'm going to invite everybody to unmute themselves if you have any questions or comments or anything that you would like to say to Tweed. I think it was a fabulous, fascinating presentation, especially those bird hats. What's up with those bird hats?
And that was, it was an extreme sort of craze at the time. I'm trying to close this. And I don't know what's up. Don't ask me about women's hats. Don't ask me. One of my favorite women's hats, by the way, is the going to meeting hats, which is very popular in the South with both black and white women. They're just amazing. And I think they're terrific. But in Boston, you still see the mostly blacks women, the older women, church-going women, their hats are magnificent.
Oh, those church lady hats are the best. I see.
You go to a store, there are stores. There's one here in Boston. They're just fabulous.
I see that Carol Levin has her hand up. Carol, do you want to speak? Would you unmute yourself?
Sure. Hi. I just want to say this was excellent. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
And you had put up early in the presentation a children's book, and I wanted to say as a retired children's librarian, there are several wonderful children's books on Teddy for people who have young people in their lives that you want to tell about. But also to mention that 4 or 5 years ago, I saw at Luna Stage in New Jersey a wonderful play called King of the Mountains, which was about the meeting between Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir. And if that ever does get performed in your area, I highly recommend it because it was a really wonderful two-handed play, the two people. And I got a great sense of the import of their association with each other and history based on that.
Well, as to children's books, the Theodore Roosevelt Association for a number of years has offered a book prize for the best book on TR for the previous year. And they just started 2 years ago having a separate prize for children's books. And so they've awarded, I think 2, or maybe the second one is coming up. You can go to their website and see what it was. But they're books on TR. And there are quite a lot of children's books on TR. I try to stay away from children's books and fictional. There are quite a lot of novels that involve TR, The Alchemist perhaps being the most famous. But I don't read them because I'm afraid they'll stick in my mind. And I don't know what's true and what is the imagination of the author. And then I'm just absorb it all as truth. And I start spouting stuff that comes from novels, not from the histories. So I tend to stay away from it.
I just want to mention that if you're interested in hearing any of Tweed's other lectures, I did post the website in the chat column, the roosevelt.liu.edu. And you can find his lectures on any number of topics relating to Theodore Roosevelt at that website. So if
By
anybody's,
the way, they're ongoing. I'm taking a hiatus this summer. I'm doing a different one. And I don't know if any of your people know Hutton House, the Hutton House lectures at Long Island University. They're great, mostly for retirees. And so I'm going to do a series of 3 talks for them this summer, June, July, and August, on each of the Roosevelts. It's called the Roosevelt School because its icons are not just TR, but also FDR and Eleanor, which gives a very broad range of subjects. And so I'll do one each on FDR, TR, and Eleanor. And I've called it, let's see, controversies and failures, or rather failures and controversies, I think. And the lady who's in charge of all that is a lady named Rita Langdon. And she said, oh, she was a little horrified. You know, failures? You want to talk about failures? Oh, of course I want to talk about failures. They're very interesting. And they all had failures. I mean, one of the things I try to do in my talks, not so much this one, is, you know, show the good and the not so good. And one of the things about TR, by the way, is he wrote so much, just extraordinary. There's a book called there's a talk, one of my talks is called Literary Fella, which is about TR and his writings and the whole history and everything, enormous amount. But he basically published everything, letters, you know, his quotes. And so you can find, you know, over his life, he developed his views. So for example, he started out with the view that somebody asked him about the thing is only good Indian is a dead Indian. And he was in the early 20s in the West when the Indian Wars was still right at the end. And he said, well, I wouldn't go so far as that, he said, but I would say that may be true in 9 out of 10 cases. Well, that's pretty embarrassing now. But he developed, I mean, no, his view changed. There seems to be this view that politicians need to take a position and never change it, you know, never grow, never learn. Well, that's ridiculous. So you can make TR be anything you want. But over his life, he had a lot of views about different things and he evolved. And one thing to keep in mind also is that when he made speech, you got to see when the quote comes from. Was it when he was in the White House or not? Because he had a whole different approach outside of the White House when he was trying to goad Wilson into getting into the First World War sooner. I mean, he said he was much more incendiary about his rhetoric to try to make, you know, his point. But he was much more careful when he was in the White House. And you got to pay attention to the differences there because there's more to making a statement in rhetoric. You know, if you start thinking about rhetoric, it depends where you're sitting. There's more about making a statement than just a statement of belief. It's a statement of persuasion, and that's a whole different issue. Anyway, questions, if any?
I have one.
Sure.
It's about
I left out the mountain man, but yes.
it's about the Redwood National Forest.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, there used to be redwood picnic tables all over the place. Everybody had one in their backyard.
Yeah, right.
And the redwood is naturally it doesn't attract ants or termites or anything like that. So it's a good long-lasting wood. But lately they've been put on I guess the endangered species list because you can't make a redwood picnic table anymore. And
that's certainly true. My house, I live on the vineyard, and I have a couple of picnic tables, and they all get eaten up. You know, no matter what I slather on them. You're right, but I don't know the specifics about when it was realized that more extensive efforts had to be taken rather than just creating national parks or national forests to protect redwood areas, which is what TR did. But there were redwoods all over the Northwest or California, the area, wherever it is. And so many of them were being cut down until quite recently. And I think I think you're right. They used they used some legislation to basically cut off the demand for it, which is a very good way of dealing with issues like this. If you can cut off the demand, if for whatever reason you can't cut off the supply, then try to cut off the demand. Now,